Ellie and I continued walking through the dense forest, wearing our reflective mylar to hide from the infrared drones. Suddenly and silently, 2 armed sentries appeared on either side of us. They were our escort to the rebel base camp. They too wore reflective mylar. We walked another mile, sometimes doubling back to make sure we were not followed or watched by drones. We came to a clearing in the forest. The sentries walked to the edge of the clearing and stood guard as a camouflaged hatch opened. This was the entrance to a maze of tunnels leading to an underground complex of shelters, kitchens, barracks, armories, and hospitals. I climbed down the shaft, careful to avoid the booby traps that Ellie warned me about. Ellie and I reported to the base commander, Roger Dexter. Everyone called him Roger. He stood behind a desk covered in maps. Roger looked up as we entered the bunker. After Ellie introduced me, Roger began telling me his story. Before the event, that's what he called it, the event, Roger had been a white-collar worker. He managed to keep his job even though he refused the jab. Roger worked from home, only venturing out to buy food and other essential chores. But one day he was stopped by a health department cop, demanding his papers. Before Roger had a chance to find his papers, Roger was jumped by the other health department cops who strapped a medical mask on his face and forced him into a van. The van traveled a long way out into the country. Roger had no idea where they were taking him. After several hours, the van arrived at Camp Wellrest, a brand-new quarantine camp surrounded by a high fence with razor wire. Roger stayed in a comfortable bungalow in which he was required to stay inside, except for 1 hour of recreation on his front porch. But at all times he was required to wear a mask. After the final lockdown was imposed, rebellions broke out in cities across the country. Counterinsurgency measures were brutal. Cities were destroyed, infrastructure ruined, populations decimated. Roger was transferred to a makeshift facility, a shopping mall repurposed as a prison. His head was shaved, and he was told to share a filthy room packed with other prisoners. Roger was now assigned with the task of clearing rubble with his fellow prisoners of the bombed and burned cities. The work needed to be done by hand since fuel for bulldozers and trucks was in very short supply. Roger labored clearing bricks and debris from collapsed buildings. At night, he was kept awake by the screams of inmates being tortured and beaten. Rebellious and weak inmates were subjected to forced injections. None survived more than a few weeks. Roger organized a revolt of the inmates. After executing the guards and confiscating their weapons, ammunition, and other supplies, they marched across the landscape of ruined cities and towns, fighting the mechanized, heavily armed health department counterinsurgency units. Eventually, the rebels, with Roger as their leader, came to this forest. After telling me his story, Roger looked at me and asked if I was ready to join them on a raid the next day. I said, hell yeah.